We're well over a year away from the next general election, but Democrats are already sounding the alarm. Fewer and fewer voters are registering as Democrats. The party has long lamented the loss of white working class voters, and there is growing concern about declining black voter participation in every election cycle. Where have all the Democrats gone? Asked the title of a recent book. Well, now we know. They've gone to the Republican Party. A report in the New York Times explaining that at the same time Democrats' rolls dropped, Republican rolls grew. Some of the GOP gains were with voters who traditionally vote Democrat, like younger voters. There are nearly twice as many Republicans as there are Democrats in Ohio, and yet the state appears to reflect the trend. 284,000 unaffiliated voters joined the Republican Party. That's compared with 114,000 Democrats. 37,000 Democrats switched to the Republican Party compared with 20,000 defections on the other side. 300,000 Democrats moved to unaffiliated status compared to 160,000 Republicans. David Niven is a political science professor at the University of Cincinnati. He joins me now to take a closer look at this trend. Professor, good to see you.
Good to be here.
I should point out that the numbers we're looking at are somewhat an apples to oranges comparison in that the New York Times looked at states with closed primaries, and yet this trend seems to be something that we're seeing here as well. Can you explain?
What the New York Times focused on were the 30 states that allow you to declare yourself a Democrat or a Republican when you register to vote. You check a box and say who you are. Ohio does things slightly differently. Ohio essentially assigns you the party that you vote in if you show up to vote in a primary. So if you vote in primaries, the state considers you to be a member of that party. If you don't vote in primaries, the state considers you to be unaffiliated. So it's a little bit different. But the big story here, though, is bad news for Democrats across the board. It doesn't matter whether a state uses the Ohio system or the system used across much of the country. The numbers are just soft. Democrats have been leaking voters, and it's really a telling sign, that Trump is not all that popular, has never been all that popular, but the Democrats haven't been able to capitalize on that during this, most recent era of politics because they're not all that popular.
There are those who would point to some changes in election law in Ohio in particular as being suppressive of potential voter participation. What do you think about that?
Well, unquestionably, Ohio has some of the most exclusionary voting rules in the nation. Voter ID rules, for example, in Ohio are the most restrictive in the nation. There's an awful lot of folks who simply don't have one of the pre-required forms of ID, especially the elderly, especially the poor. That's a separate problem for Democrats. They begin with the problem of not having people on their side, not having people dedicated to having a Democratic identity. Then on top of that, they face that turnout hurdle where these restrictions are, as a whole, making it harder for Democrats in Ohio and much of, the kind of Republican-leaning states that have similar restrictions.
Does this change the status of the state? As I think it's already changed, but does it further deepen our sort of separation from being a battleground?
Well, Ohio was the battleground. Literally for a century, from 1912 to 2012, no state voted more closely than to the nation's totals than Ohio. No state better predicted presidential outcomes. We fell out of that and have become reliably Republican in the last 10 and 15 years. The question right now is, can there still be Democratic moments? Can there be a moment in 2026 if Trump remains unpopular and the Democrats field candidates like Sherrod Brown? Can they still win in Ohio? So the Ohio question is no longer battleground. It's, is Ohio worthy of any battle at all? Is Ohio still in play at all, even in good circumstances for Democrats?
What about Ohio being a barometer for all of this in terms of the trend that we have seen in the growing number of people registering as Republicans?
Well, I think the Ohio story that tells a lot about the nation has been, the relative weakness of Democrats in Northeast Ohio, industrial Ohio, and their slippage across Appalachian Ohio. that's an awful lot of the story across the nation. The Democratic Party's loss of white working class voters, white voters in poverty, that's something that, really tells the story of why did Ohio go from a battleground state to reliably Republican? Because without those voters, Democrats just aren't viable statewide. And a big part of this is when folks were voting their pocketbooks, if you could predict how somebody voted by their economics, that made Ohio, which is economically diverse, a good state for Democrats. But if folks are voting demographics, Ohio is not demographically representative of the nation, and that really hurts Democrats.
And the polarization being what it is, how much of this could be a reflection of the redistricting fights that we have been seeing here and will see in the future?
Well, Ohio is almost defined by redistricting fights at this point, more than battleground status. And the short answer is the more predictable voters are, the more set in their ways there are, the easier it is to gerrymander them. And that's been a part of the Ohio story. If folks are going to be reliably Republican, then you can draw districts that reliably produce Republican victories, even if it's a bad election year, even if they have bad candidates. So these things absolutely do play hand in hand. Folks become committed to a party, the slippage of Democratic numbers into the Republican Party, it gets easier and easier to draw districts that exaggerate the strength of Republicans. Because, of course, when you draw that district, you only need to give it slightly more Republicans than Democrats to make it a reliably Republican district.
Professor David Niven from the University of Cincinnati. Professor, thank you.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you for watching our YouTube channel. Let Spectrum News be your resource for balanced, in-depth political coverage, and click the subscribe button right here. You can also download our app or watch us on TV to learn more about the candidates, where they stand on the issues, and more. We'll see you then.